Welcome, brothers and sisters, friends, neighbors, and everyone, once again to the Leo and Larry Show, the show that tells you the places where you need to go and the things that you need to know. And I have on, once again, several of you told us how excited you are when he comes on. My good friend and our freedom fighter and change agent, Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, who is the Senior Vice President for National Wildlife Federation, among many, many, many other things that he does. So for those who don't know you and haven't heard you on this show previously, why don't you give them just a quick synopsis of what you've done in your life and what has brought you to this place and time. And
Well,
welcome.
well,
Mhm.
let me give honor to my both my mother and my grandmother, who are the rocks that I stand on, my ancestors who paved the path for me to be here right now. I've been working on social justice issues since I was 16 years old. Been working on environmental justice issues for 3 decades now, and helped to found the Office of Environmental Justice at EPA as a student. Worked on Capitol Hill for a couple of years for Chairman John Conyers, when he was chairman of the Judiciary Committee. I've been an advisor to a couple of White Houses, and I've worked in over 1,000 communities, both in our country and abroad. So I'm very thankful to those who have allowed me to hold space with them, to listen, to learn, and to be able to share and advocate for change inside of our communities.
That's great. Well, tell folks a little bit about National Wildlife Federation. We've been blessed to do some things with that organization and several other people we know. So in terms of conservation, we have some conservation groups here, Sierra Club, Conservation Voters of South Carolina, but explain a little bit about what National Wildlife Federation does, please.
I think the best way to start that conversation is actually go to the first principle of environmental justice of those 17 principles. The first principle speaks to honoring Mother Earth, ecological unity, and the interdependence of all species, because we know that we all need each other to be able to survive on this planet, hopefully to thrive. So the National Wildlife Federation meets that moment in relationship to that first principle because there's a big focus on wildlife and making sure that it is protected. And we know many folks have different types of relationships with wildlife. For some folks who are fishermen or hunters, it's a critical need. Also, we know that for us to continue to live on this planet, we've got to make sure that we're protecting, those spaces that have the new sets of medicines that will be discovered, and those traditional medicines that are out there. And we also understand that when we're dealing with the climate crisis, we have to protect, things like our grasslands, which hold a lot of carbon and don't allow it to go into the atmosphere, along with the trees that play such a critical role in helping to address the climate crisis and to help to protect human life, giving us the shade that's necessary for our bodies to be able to deal with these extreme temperatures that are going on. So the National Wildlife Federation protects both wildlife, natural spaces, and also honors humans in relationship there. So it's an interconnected relationship that we have. It's an over 80-year-old organization. It continues to evolve and grow. And now we also have an environmental justice pillar that is a part of our strategic plan. So it's almost a full circle relationship from where it started to where it is today. We still have a lot of work to do, but we're lucky that we get to stand in partnership and allyship with a number of frontline organizations that are doing the very important work of protecting human health and the environment.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the problems that we have is that unfortunately human beings have evolved to the point where they no longer see themselves as a part of nature, but separate from nature. And I believe that is one of the roots to so many of the problems that we're having.
Yeah, I would agree with you. There are different paradigms that people operate from. If we can have a real conversation, we know the colonizers saw themselves as being over top of nature and others that they did not see having the same level of value as themselves. But then there is also the traditional way that indigenous people, and Black folks are indigenous people. We are the original indigenous peoples of the planet. Our Native American and indigenous brothers, sisters, and family. Many of our people of color have always lived in harmony with nature and understood the interconnected relationship that exists there. And if something is out of balance, then negative things can happen. But when we can stay in balance, then we know that things can thrive. So unfortunately, we have allowed a learning system to be the predominant one that did not value having a balanced relationship with nature and with our ecosystem.
Mhm. And you mentioned climate change, and we know, look, as I tell people, if you don't believe climate change is real, especially during these last couple of weeks, just go outside and then come back in and tell us you don't believe that it's real, with this extreme heat. But there's also been, we look at the fact that all of the world and our scientists in so many countries, so many um, non-governmental organizations, et cetera, are calling for us to move away from fossil fuels and other practices that are harming not only nature and the climate, but also communities. And so how about, I know there's been some Supreme Court cases and some things that are going on in terms of policy, politics, those sort of things. And I know you keep up with it. So why don't you share some of that with our audience, Mustafa?
Yeah, well, I keep up with it because it's critical for our communities, right? Because often we're not a part of the conversations and the strategy around these major decisions that are going on. So we've got other folks making decisions that often have a negative impact inside of our respective communities. And that's the reason that we've got to show up in those spaces, even though we might be tired, even though we might have just worked a double or whatever the situation might be. So, a few of the major things that have happened recently are very deadly for our communities. And, I don't like sugarcoating stuff. And people will say, well, it may not be that significant or important. And I'm like, well, that's easy to say when you're not one of the communities that live on the front lines. So when you have
Yes.
cases, when you have cases like the Supreme Court case, the Chevron case, that recently was decided by the Supreme Court, you see how individuals are trying to grab hold of power and restructure governments. And they're doing that with real intentionality. So I'll talk a little bit about what the Chevron case is, but I also want to put the context for folks of understanding that people are trying to grab hold of power because they know there's a changing demographic in America. They understand
Yes.
that within the next 20 years, that America will no longer be a majority white nation. It will be a majority people of color nation. And so that it has created a set of dynamics that people knew were coming, and the reason that why they're trying to do some of this restructuring. So the Chevron case is a prime example of grabbing power and restructuring government. So the Chevron case was a case that had 40 years of settled case law. The original case was Chevron versus NRDC. It was an air case, and wanted to make sure NRDC wanted to make sure that that we had cleaner air. And at that time, it's interesting because you had Republicans that were leading on the court. You had a Republican president at that time that thought that by moving power to the federal agencies who have the expertise was the direction to go to be able to literally hold on to power. Now, it was a good thing that they did it. They weren't doing it for the right reasons, but it was a good thing because the people at the Environmental Protection Agency, who are the biologists and toxicologists and other types of scientists, have expertise that when folks on Capitol Hill create a law, they don't know everything that's going to happen on the ground in relationship to that law. So they gave deference to those federal agencies, whether it's the Environmental Protection Agency or Housing and Urban Development or Department of Transportation. There's a number of different agencies and departments that are out there that when these laws are created, then have to figure out how to implement them, how to put the rules in place. And for 40 years, it was agreed that the expertise was there inside of those agencies. Fast forward 40 years to just last week, what you find in that space is that members of the Supreme Court said that we know better than the folks who have, gone to school, gotten degrees in various specialities and worked 10, 20, 30, 40 years in a space of what the law should look like, or what the policies should actually look like, and how they should be implemented and how they should play out. What does that mean for folks inside of our communities? That means that you have someone who is a judge who's making a decision about what needs to happen in relationship to clean air or clean water or the land that you walk on, if you're looking in the environmental context, or what we should be doing about the climate crisis, if it is in relationship to the Food and Drug Administration. They now have the ability to actually make decisions about a particular drug and the interactions that would happen. Now, all of us know that someone who studied law probably doesn't have expertise in science. So
Right.
whether we're talking about that or we're talking about the SEC, which it also affects, now judges will be making decisions about financial operations and how things move and the wealth that could or could not make it into your communities. Then you have to take a step back, Rev, in relationship to the Chevron case and ask yourself, based upon the sets of actions that people have seen over the last few years from the Supreme Court, have they been actually ruling in a favor that has been helpful to Black and Brown and Indigenous communities? And you would be hard pressed to find a set of actions that probably would lead you in that direction if you're having an honest analysis. So that's the Chevron, sort of the real quick and dirty about the Chevron case. They've moved power from the individuals, the agencies that have expertise, to the courts, to those judges they now have the final decision.
Wow. That can have really catastrophic impacts.
It can, especially when we look at these other sets of actions that are all happening at the same time. So when we look at the immunity case, right? A lot of people paid attention to that. They turned on their TVs, whether they're moving past CNN, MSNBC, Fox, whomever it might be that you might watch. The immunity case said that the president of the United States now cannot be charged for anything that is tied to official duties, right? Now, whether you're looking at the Chevron case is an example of how the Supreme Court reached down into lower courts and brought this case up, and the Chevron case never needed to come back up because for 40 years it had already been decided. But they made a strategic move in being able to do that so that they could garner some power. Then you overlay it with this immunity case that was going on, which folks saw that former President Trump now, because the case was about him, now he and future presidents, if someone is elected in relationship to their official duties, now have immunity. Now the question becomes, the Supreme Court also said that's on the official duty side. Unofficial has now been kicked down to the lower court, and then they'll have to make a decision about what that looks like, what that is, and how that plays out. But all those two things come together because now you have a conservative, some would say radical Supreme Court that is now taking its chunk of power. Now you have a president who now has unlimited power, so they can pretty much do or say anything they want without worrying about ramifications. And then you have to overlay it with the thing that now people are already starting to pay attention to. I tried for over a year to get people to pay attention to it, and that's Project 2025, which is a complete restructuring of government and the elimination of many of the most important agencies and programs for folks who have been working diligently around civil rights and human rights and economic justice and transportation and housing justice, so forth and so on. And we can unpack Project 2025 as well if you'd like to.
Oh yeah, I was going to say, first of all, does this mean possibly that former President Trump's whatever responsibility he may have had for January 6th, that he may not be held accountable in any way because of either the Supreme Court's decision about official duties or because it seems like that would be part of his official duties. And so is that one of the things that may come out of that?
Yeah, there is an interpretation. So there are a number of cases right now against former President Trump. Many of those have now been delayed because of the Supreme Court's decision around immunity. There's still one that's actually been moved to September, I believe. So that is one of the cases that had already been decided, but his legal team is going back to all of those cases and saying, because of what the Supreme Court has
Right.
said, you need to kick this out and no longer move forward on it. So there is both ramifications here in this moment for former actions that President Trump did. And then, of course, moving forward is some of the even scarier things that folks will have to deal with and navigate.
Right. So that means in terms of having immunity, that if the president during his or her course of them enacting working on their formal duties, they cannot be held legally bound by certain actions. I guess if you murdered someone, you still would be able to be arrested, right?
Well, that's actually up to interpretation now. The most egregious types of things that we hope would never happen, right? You've heard people probably talk about, some of the folks who are on TV. Well, the president could go out in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody, or he could have SEAL Team 6 take out someone, so forth and so on, or he could call up the militia and have them go into a respective city and do X, Y, and Z. We remember when President Trump was in office before, and when the Black Lives Matter protests were going on, that he wanted to utilize the military, wanted to utilize the National Guard to put those peaceful protests down. Well, that could all be supersized now, right? It could. I'm not saying that it would, but he now has that type of flexibility that no matter what it is, if it's an official duty, then he cannot be prosecuted for it. Now, the question becomes the individuals who surround the president, would they move forward on what he asked them to do or demanded for them to do? In the last round, when he was in, you had folks who were willing to stand up and say, no, we're not going to do this because it will have X, Y, and Z impacts. When you look at Project 2025 and the types of individuals that they're going to bring into the mix, you will no longer have that basic check and balance between sort of like the generals and the president. But even in a much broader context, there is a shifting and a rebuilding. Well, first there's a breaking down and then a rebuilding of a new government. And people often ask me, well, what does that mean? What does that look like? Is there any historical examples? And I say, yes, there are a number of them, but some that might actually get your attention is the plan that Nazis put in place before they were able to take over Germany and bring in Nazism, and then all of the egregious actions that came out of that. Now, for most folks, they weren't around at that time. If you're not a student of history, you may have some general ideas, but you may not understand the fullness of the totality of those impacts. Then for most folks, we were around or it's close enough to us to understand the dynamics that went on in South Africa in relationship to apartheidism and how a small group was able to actually take over and create indentured servitude, if you want to label it that way, with the plans that they put in place. So Project 2025 has a lot of similarities to how folks take over power and then begin to sort of put their thumb, or let me say it betterly, put their knee on the necks of the individuals that have always been vulnerable.
I was gonna say not thumb, foot or neck,
Yeah.
but explain to folks who are the authors of Project 2025? Who put this together? Who is advocating for it? Who is working diligently to turn this into reality?
Yeah, no,
So,
it's an excellent question because former President Trump was just on the television saying that he knows nothing about Project 2025, right? Now, if we didn't know the fact that when he was in office over the 4 years, he was found to have lied over 30,000 times. That's like 21 times a day. And you know, all the time that he was there, then you might give the glimmer of possibility that he was telling the truth, just on the surface. But
mhm,
let's pull back the veneer. So the individuals who are responsible for creating Project 2025 actually come out of the Trump administration. So what you find is you have a couple of folks like the Heritage Foundation, you have ALEC, which is another right-wing sort of think tank group that
mhm,
played a role in building the structure. And then you also have about 20 of folks who used to actually work in the senior levels of the Trump administration. So for him to say that he did not know anything about it, and then of course, we also know that the individuals who actually put the pen to paper, you know, thanked President Trump for his support in the creation of this. Then, you know, his story no longer holds water that he did not know.
and so Project 2025, folks can get information where about it, or
Yeah.
is it online, or how can they find out more about it?
It
And
is
then you
online.
get about the actual restructuring of what
Yeah.
agencies people are planning to do away with, like the Department of Education and the Environmental Protection Agencies, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. So all you got to do is Google Project 2025 and it will pop up now because everybody, a lot of people are talking about it and being concerned about it. Whether you're talking about independents or Democrats, or the shrinking majority of folks who label themselves as Republicans and not MAGA Republicans, have really great concerns because they understand that this goes against many of the things that the founders, you know, had built and talked about, even though that wasn't perfect. But this really takes things far, far, far away from anything that's supposed to be a part of democracy. I'm not going to send people to the link that has the 900-page document that then gives those folks a hit. So they can say, wow, look at all these people who are reading this. They must be in support of it. I would just say, just type in Project 2025 and review, and you'll find many sites that will come up that will walk you through. You can go to the Center for American Progress. You can go to a number of places where folks will break down for you what it is and why it's important to educate yourself on it, and then to determine whom you might want to vote for. Do you want to vote for folks who are trying to strip away your rights and your resources, or do you want to vote for somebody who actually cares about uplifting community and moving toward a North Star, which is justice?
Mhm. And so, can you tell us some of the agencies, some of the policies
Yeah.
that they're advocating
Mhm.
to change or do away with?
Yeah. Let's do that, and let's also talk about some of the macro stuff as well. So one of the things that Project 2025 talks about, and they just recently had folks who are on national TV talking about it is a revolution, and that it will be a peaceful revolution unless folks begin to push back against it. and then there can be a different type of revolution. So that tells you exactly where their mindset is. One of the
mhm,
things that they plan on doing or beginning on day one is actually removing folks from the federal agencies and replacing them with their own individuals. They want to start with 5,000 people. Now, for most folks, they may not understand that one of the largest employers of people of color is the federal government.
yes.
So that means that there'll be a whole lot of black folks and brown folks who will no longer be there. So some people might care about that, some won't. It also means that when policies are being developed, you will no longer have those individuals, one, who have expertise, but two, who also understand how they can have impacts inside of our communities. They'll no longer have a voice that's in that process. Those folks you may have built relationships with over the years will no longer be there. There's also a list of individuals. Some folks are calling it the hit list of individuals whom they plan on taking out and focusing
Mhm,
upon, so forth and so on. So that's, for us who are also worried and focusing on the wealth gap that exists inside of our communities and understanding. You remember, your mom or your grandmother say, go get one of those good government jobs and be able to
oh,
move
yeah.
into the middle class.
Mhm,
That will be one of the pathways that there'll be a much more difficult time. The other side
yeah.
of it is, Rev, something you just raised is actually digging down deeper into those agencies. So they plan on getting rid of the Department of Education. So we know that so many of our mothers and fathers, grandparents, and others fought hard to get us the opportunity to have a better set of public education because they
Mhm,
would like to privatize education. And that means that we know that we're going to always end up on the short end of the stick. We remember some of those former court cases that talked about separate but equal, and we never ended up being equal in our community. So by allowing them to get rid of the Department of Education, that means you would no longer have that watchdog. You would no longer have that agent or that department that then takes a deep look at what's going on across the country and finding where there are disproportionate impacts that are happening. So that would no longer be in place. And then, of course, all of the craziness that would come out of that. The Department of Justice is another entity that many of us have been working for years to make sure that there was fairness and equity. And we've seen that currently this Department of Department of Justice has actually been doing its job. It's been going after bad players. It's been going after rogue cops and rogue sort of police departments across the country. It's just one example of where they've been showing up. They've also been showing up in the environmental space and prosecuting cases against folks who have been polluting inside of our communities. There's a laundry list of things that the Department of Justice has responsibility for, and they want to weaken the Department of Justice or eliminate it. So we
mhm,
need to pay attention to that as well. The Environmental Protection Agency is another one. We know that in our communities, we're still fighting to be able to have clean air and clean water and to be able to address the climate crisis. Well, there will no longer be any work happening in relationship to climate. There will no longer probably be any work happening in relationship to environmental justice because they will eliminate that. And then we also know that they will begin to weaken the other types of things that are happening around clean air and clean water and some of the other aspects that are inside of the Environmental Protection Agency. So there are a number of agencies and departments that we could go through where they are either going to weaken them or they are proposing that they no longer exist. And that once again is about garnering power and putting profit over people
mhm,
because the other individuals that are behind the Supreme Court cases and Project 2025 are some of the largest billionaires inside of our country and some of the corporations that are in there that have wanted less regulation, that have wanted less inspections happening. And that's because they want to maximize profit. There's nothing wrong with making profit, but that profit should not shorten people's lives. And that profit should
mhm,
not, cause many of these health impacts that are going on. So Project 2025 gives them the opportunity to be able to do that without there being any checks and balances anymore, because we've now got the Supreme Court side, you got the presidential side, which there's no longer, they've now got the immunity, and now you wrap it all up in this bow of both. It's just amazing to even think that something like this can happen, but a bow of oppression.
Mhm. Wow. And this is all, it's so counter to what scientists and human rights advocates of around the planet are telling us. We should be reducing fossil fuel emissions. We should be working at having more justice, more diversity, more equity, more inclusion. And instead, it's as if we're moving away from all of those very crucial things that we need very badly, not only in this country, but around the world. Because there's a saying, is the South the nation goes. I think there's a similar statement that can be made in terms of as the United States goes, a large part of the world goes, correct?
Without a doubt. For those of us who are Black folk, we understand the impacts that slavery and Jim Crowism had both on our mind, bodies, and souls. When you look at many of these actions that are part of both Project 2025 and some of the Supreme Court actions, it is really about a Jim Crow 2.0 that they're trying to implement. At one time in this country, Black folks had no autonomy over their bodies, right? When you look at Project 2025 and how it tries to strip away women's rights to autonomy on their healthcare choices, it really shows not only the egregiousness, but the devilry of individuals and what they will actually do to be able to control people. So, it's just, if you understand the history of how we got to this moment, this is plans that started during the Reagan administration, and they were looking for the right moment to be able to move forward. And for someone to actually, the old Maya Angelou quote, when she says, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. The goal for someone to be able to put a 900-page document in front of the country and say, this is who we are and this is what we are going to do. And for folks not to take that serious says something about the education that still needs to happen to empower people to not only understand the destructiveness of this, but how it could, not just break down democracy, because we have this conversation about democracy, which is important, but for folks who are just putting food on the table, folks are sitting in the barber shop, just the word democracy alone is not enough. Folks need to understand how it is going to impact them on a daily basis and how it will take away rights like rights were once taken away, 70, 60, 70 years ago.
Yes, I often tell people that if we are not cognizant of in regards to what's going on, we may very well find ourselves in a world where a few wealthy people and corporations with some government entities are running and controlling everything. Automation, robotics, AI will do away with a lot of jobs. And, we may well see segments of our population, maybe large segments of the population that are just sitting in the house, looking at videos, playing video games, looking at TikTok, Facebook, and, have their EBT card so that they can order food with Instacart and their alcohol and their marijuana. And and they're just sitting in the house, vegetating and spending money. especially if we have that guaranteed income that both Dr. King and Andrew Yang, when he was running for president, talked about but from different perspectives. I mean, the the world that could be possible where rights are rolled back, institutions, agencies have disappeared is very possible at this moment in time. And I don't think very many people see the full picture as you portrayed it. But on the other hand, there has to be some messages of hope. And I'm sure you know some of them or some call to actions and some activities that people can get involved in. So what are some of the things that you're seeing, Mustafa?
Well, there's finally awakening about this particular sets of actions that are going on, around Project 2025, around the Supreme Court cases to help people to understand how it will play out in their communities. But we don't stop there because we also have the opportunity to change some of those dynamics, right? So just like we had 40 years of settled case law with a conservative right-wing Supreme Court, by voting and getting the opportunity to place new members on the court, things can always come back around and we can make change there. We can also make change on Capitol Hill. So in those Supreme Court cases, in many instances, they've also said that the members of the House and the Senate have the opportunity to write new laws, and to make sure that they are, as expansive as folks might like, that they're covering whatever the additional gaps may be. So there is an opportunity, but all that goes back to something my grandmother used to say when she said, you have power unless you give it away. And she used to also say that power was tied to your vote. And so if we vote, we get to make sure that even when people do these negative types of things, that we have the ability to address them and to fix them. So, but that also means that one, we have to educate ourselves, and then we have to move off of that couch, stop being medicated. There's a reason why there is a liquor store on many corners. There's a reason now why there is a dispensary in many locations, and that
Mm-hmm.
people hope that, you just get so comfortable in your chair or your couch that, that's where you will remain. So you have a choice. That's the beauty of living in our country. You can vote or not vote, but if you don't get
Mm-hmm.
engaged, and you know me, Rev, for a long time, I don't tell anybody who to vote for. I say vote for somebody
Right.
who cares about your community. Vote for somebody who is willing to stand up and push, make sure that you get the resources you need. So we have power that exists there. And in this moment, there's no better time to figure out how you want to utilize your vote, both on the local, the county, the state, and the federal level. Because sometimes people be like, well, I don't want to vote for such and such because they did
Mm-hmm.
this one thing or two things not correctly to be president. But my thing is, but there's a whole lot of other people that you should and could be voting for. And if you haven't found somebody and you've known for a while that you couldn't find somebody, why aren't you running? Or why
Yeah.
aren't you finding someone who's in your community that you could get behind? So that whole thing that I'm just disconnecting doesn't sit well with me, because that means that you haven't really expanded your vision and then got engaged to bring somebody in who you could support. So we have power. We just got to use it.
Yes, and we had another guest on recently, and we had a little bit of a conversation around how do we educate our policymakers? How do we educate our officials who are elected locally, countywide, statewide, and as well as on the federal level? Because I'm sure that you have experienced the same thing that I have, that oftentimes we're electing people to office who really don't understand or even are aware of, some of the things that you mentioned and things that are happening on the local level. And without that lack of the education, they're going to make horrible decisions. So
Mhm.
I'm trying to figure out how do we make it a prerequisite among the voters that we need to be electing people who have knowledge, information, and experience in terms of relating to some of these very crucial existential issues. So that existential meaning that they actually impact the existence of life on this planet for flora, for animals, for human beings. And of course, in order to be able to make those changes, you have to have a governing system in place where the voices of the downtrodden and the least among us can be heard. So that I'm struggling with this. I know you probably don't have the magical answer, but as someone who has been on Capitol Hill and walked those hallways, is there a way that we can elect better candidates or educate the ones who are in office now?
Well, I think yes, yes, and yes, and then there's and. So the and is beginning to get in front of what we know is a problem, right? So we need to be bringing forward homegrown candidates. And that means that we've got to financially support them so they have the time that's necessary. We have to mentor them. We have to, make sure that we are taking them to the spaces and places so they can see for themselves what the impacts look like, and then also supplementing that by sharing what success looks like. Because often when Black folks and brown folks have been able to figure out a formula of success, it doesn't get the attention, right? I can't tell you how many successful programs that our people have had, and then I'll go and see other projects that are not even nearly as successful, but because they came from other communities, they got a lot more attention. Now, sometimes because people have relationships, with the press or others to help them to be able to get their message out there. So for me, it is about us also not just going to the same well for politicians, but bringing in a new cast of folks who are anchored in community. And then making sure that they have all of the tools that they need to be successful. And then, just like I do with everybody else, there is an accountability aspect, having an honest conversation with them. That one, I understand that it's not easy to get things done and to get the right types of legislation forward, but there is a set of expectations that are actually connected to action. That if you are not able to do it in the time frame that we agree upon, then that means that we'll be moving our vote to somebody else. And often
Absolutely.
we give our vote without that accountability aspect, right? I don't care if you're Black or you're brown, or if you're independent or Democrat, or there might be a possibility that you might even be a Republican, whatever, because everybody has the ability to do the right thing, just some folks decide not to, right? So for me, I use that both on the local level and then all the way up, right? I have an expectation that if you want to run for president, that you should be coming to our areas to see what's going on, having conversations with folks, and then deciding based upon what you've seen and the expertise that's there, how you want to move forward on what your platform looks like, and then what your sets of promises are, and that it is not just when you are running, but there is an expectation that you will be back and then in a year or whatever the time frame is, because we just kind of leave it out there for folks, right? Whether they're trying to be a congressman or a senator or a president or whatever it might be, that once you come through, then that's enough, and it's not. Now, how do we make that happen? We make that happen through building strong coalitions. And if you don't have strong coalitions, then they will play one against the other. I don't think it really matters what party they're coming from. That is just somehow
Absolutely.
people get in their ears. And so we've got to make sure that you have those coalitions that are going to continue to support when you're doing the right thing, and when you're not, going to put pressure on your chest until you understand that you have a responsibility here, and that whatever that time frame is, if you're not meeting it, then we will no longer be supporting you.
Mhm. And we have to learn too, I believe, to keep our eye on the ball, especially with policy.
Yep.
It was many years ago, about mid 2000, well, more early 2000, um, a fellow who was the comptroller um, for New York State, Carl McCall, decided to run for governor. And I guess when he decided to run for governor, it was an unsuccessful bid. I was at a press conference in Manhattan, and someone asked him and said, "Hey, look, we have all of these states that have billions of dollars that they've raised with the educational lotteries. So why is it that our schools still are struggling financially? Why do I have to buy tissue and loose leaf papers and pencils for my child when there are billions of dollars in this educational lottery?" And he said, never keep your eye off the ball. He said, yes, there were referendums, there were votes cast to make the educational lottery a reality in many states. He said, but what we did, what people did was they took their eye off the ball when with every act, every law, every ordinance, there's dollars tied to it. And folks were so happy to have a lottery, they never paid attention to how the state legislature was budgeting the money. That X amount of money went for buses, X amount to repair schools, X amount to build new schools, X amount for teachers, supplies, and a lot of the rest of the money went into the general budget for the elected officials to spend any way they choose. So I think that's an important piece too, that when we put people in office and they're passing legislation, we have to keep our eye on it. It's not just enough to get it passed. You agree, my friend? But also we have to see how it's going to be budgeted and administered, right?
Yeah, and what the criteria is that folks are going to use to make a decision about where resources are going to go. So we got to make sure that we're a part of that, because it's easy to
Mhm.
kind of get frozen out or overlooked, or not have what folks are looking for, as a part of the final decision making.
Mhm.
There have been a number of great folks that I've been blessed to be mentored by or to learn from because they were, before my time. Adam Clayton Powell Jr. is one of those that I
Oh
studied,
yeah.
and I
Mhm.
really appreciated how he understood how resources flowed. And the Powell Amendment was so critically important in making sure that none of those pieces of legislation were going to move forward unless it met the sets of things that he put in place. And we've got to get back to that mentality. And Rev, I think that speaks to what you were just talking about understanding how resources flow on the state and the federal level, and making sure that we have the right individuals who are there in the design phase, and then that the voices of communities play a role in some of the decision making and accountability and review process, because you know how dollars, they roll out like in waves. So
Mhm.
after one wave goes through, we need to be able to evaluate, was it able to achieve said goal? Did it make it to the people who need the dollars the most? And if not, we need to make some modifications to that so that each wave we have the opportunity to do that. And we've got to create the space for folks on the federal government side to be able to appreciate that, and make sure they understand that it's not just a wish list thing, but it is a piece that has to happen if we're going to have a successful process. The other person that I'll raise their name and bring into our conversation that I mentioned earlier was Chairman John Conyers, who I work for. You know,
Mhm.
in the evening time, we would have conversations about a number of really important things. But he used to say, Mustafa, if you want to know if something is a priority, all you got to do is look at the budget. How much money are they actually dedicating to this? And that will tell you if it is something that is truly a priority, or if it is something that folks are just trying to be able to check a box.
Mhm.
And I think that we have to be very clear and being able to sort of see through the veneers that often exist when someone says it's a priority, or is it truly a priority?
Right, right, absolutely. And wow, we're out of time already.
Well, we won't even get to into the conversation about the dollars that have went out the door and who they got to and who they haven't got to, but maybe that's
That's
another show.
right. Look, the billions of dollars that are
Yeah.
going out the door as we speak.
Yeah.
And look, let's see if we can get you to come back on again, because
Okay.
this is a conversation I'm sure people who are listening are going to want to know about the billions of dollars that are leaving the federal coffers right now, where those dollars are going. Why are people still struggling to get grants, et cetera, when there's so much money out there, but it's not getting to the communities and the places where they're needed the most? So, um, hate to cut it off, brother. You and I can talk for days, but please, I know how busy your schedule is, and let's see if we can get you on again in the near future to continue this conversation. Also about political maneuverings, and I'll just say what I thought of my mind, shenanigans that are going on also, okay?
Mhm.
So why don't you tell folks how they can reach you and get more information?
There are a few different ways. You can go to MustafaSantiagoAli.com. That'll take you to my website. If you're on X, which was Twitter, you can find me at EJN Action, EJINACTION. If you're on Instagram, you can find me at Mustafa Santiago Ali. And I think those are the number of probably the major places that people find me.
Okay, great. And thank you so much for blessing us. And I know the audience appreciates it, as I always appreciate you. And to our audience, if you want to reach out to me, New Alpha Community Development Corporation, you can go to info@newalphacdc.com. Don't forget to visit our website, newalphacdc.com. And you can also call me at the church where I'm still blessed the pastor. Thank you, Lord. And that's Kingdom Living Temple, 705 South Irby Street, Florence, South Carolina. Telephone number 843-799-0740. And so our amazing guest, Dr. Mustafa Santiago Ali, thank you once again. And for all of our listening audience, remember, if you want to find out the things that you need to know and the places where you need to go, it's the Leo and Larry Show. God bless you.